Hi, everyone. How are you? Good. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you for that absolutely wonderful introduction. This is my first time in Arkansas, and it's a pleasure to be here. I heard in the introduction a reference to my 2 times at the White House. The last time, of course, was under President Clinton, so it was really fun for me today to have a tour of the library and see, different engagements where I was present. So that was really kind of very personal and very nice, and made it really very touching for me this afternoon. So I want to thank you first for welcoming here today. I know that introduction that Joyce made, it was a great setup for what I'm going to talk about. When I was thinking about my remarks for you this afternoon, I wanted to sort of give you a scene setter first of why I think Africa is important to the United States, but then also kind of connect that with some of the challenges and some of the positive things that are going on the continent. Because I think here in the United States, there's always just this vision of the negative about the continent, and there's a lot of very, very good positive things going on. I will be sharing some stats that I think help put this in perspective, give you a nice scene setter. So I'll be flipping through a few slides while I'm talking, so that as I'm mentioning the stats, you can really get a feel for the impact of what I'm referring to. So really, today we're in the midst of a global environment that really is very, very different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly even a year ago. We live in a global context that is really a dichotomy, in my view, one with opportunities offered through technology advancement that help us live our lives better, longer, and certainly differently. But we also live in a world today that's insecure, that has extreme poverty, and we have many, many of our humankind around the world living in very, very dire and desperate circumstances. If you're following international news today at all, you can see just how much the world has changed, just even in the last year. We have the continued surge of the Islamic State, the massive influx of refugees and migrants into Europe as a result of the conflicts in Libya and in Syria. You have the same happening within Africa today, East and West Africa, tons of refugees, and also a lot of issues with climate change, disaster, and drought. You have the ongoing tensions in the Ukraine. We have the conflicts going on still in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then you also have this terrorism belt that I've been calling the Sahel extreme terrorism belt that runs from Tunisia through Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and all the way over to the east coast of the continent. However, despite all of those challenges, I think that there are new partners out there, politically, culturally, and economically, with whom the U.S. can further engage for the long term, despite these very turbulent times that I've highlighted. And I would argue that one of those regions is the continent of Africa. When I'm talking about Africa today, I'm talking about the 47 countries in the sub-Saharan region, specifically. So let's start with answering those questions. Why is this region important? What does this region mean for the United States? What does it mean as a strategic partner, as an economic partner, as an investment partner, and most importantly to me, as a cultural partner? In other words, what are the elements of the U.S.-Africa relationship? If we look at the 3 main themes of the current U.S.-Africa relationship, I believe you will see why I think the U.S.-Africa relationship is so important. Right now, the context is the following. You have overarching themes of investing in Africa's future. That means outreach to Africa's young people. It's important to have peace and stability in the region, and it's important to govern for the next generation. And what that translates into good governance, transparency, fighting against corruption, and all of those challenges that we hear about. But primarily, I want to put my remarks in the context of demographics, because I think the demographics really highlight the challenges that the continent is facing. And when I talk about demographics, I'm not talking about population stats specifically, but I'm talking about everything that is measurable and also some things that are non-measurable. Perceptions, for example, that impacts how the continent moves or doesn't move forward over the next decade and over the next 20 years. This includes population sizes, the breakdown between age and gender, where the resources are, where is most of the water, where is most of the timber, where are the oil resources. Those are issues. In-country regional differences and challenges. And this also includes what each country's development path is going to be. Africa is not a cookie cutter, even though we tend to think of it that way sometimes here in the United States. Each country will have its own path to democracy. Each country will have different challenges that it has to face. I think we as partners have to recognize this. So I see this basket of demographics that require the U.S. to see Africa today differently, not only because it's an important region to engage with, but I also believe it's an important region to build partnerships with, including working with Africa on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, it is in our national interest to do so, but I also think it's also the right thing for us to do. As you might know, last year at the UN session, I was a delegate at that session. 197 countries signed the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is commonly referred to as the SDGs. And what that did was to really become another anti-poverty campaign from now, 2015 really, to 2030, building on the previous Millennium Development Goals. There were 5 goals, and in the context of the challenges that I'm going to highlight, keep in mind those 5 goals. It's really combating hunger, improving education and health, particularly maternal health and infant mortality, assisting with job creation, and also assisting with well-being. How do you feel where you are? Do you feel safe? Do you feel comforted? Is your family well taken care of? That term well-being is being more and more used by a lot of organizations. So taking a closer look at some of the geopolitical and economic demographics along with the SDGs, I want to start by really giving you a picture of where Africa is today. Okay, on through that. The current population of the continent is 1.1 billion people. The projected growth of the continent is 2.4 billion by 2050. That is a lot of people that we need to work with and to engage with. But the most significant thing about that is that half that number will be between the ages of 10 years old and 24. Again, half that figure. I'm emphasizing that sub-figure because I see it as Africa's population dividend, meaning for me, it's a positive. But of course, it has the potential to also be a challenge. The stats that I have just highlighted will move Africa from the 3rd largest continent in the world in terms of population to the 1st over the next decades. But remember, I said that there were some specific challenges that I wanted you to think about. 75 million. That's the current number of young Africans looking for work today. That is an extraordinary number. There's 1.2 billion people of working age today looking for work. Within that figure, 75 million of them live on the continent. 10 million. That's the number of young Africans of working age that get added to that 7 million figure every single year. You have 547 million Africans without any kind of light or energy or power. The average income, if you want to call it, is $1.25 a day. And what do I really mean by that $1.25 per day? Is that a guaranteed $1.25 every day when you get up in the morning? Or does that mean your entire day is going to be searching for at least $1.25 a day to feed yourself and your family? You have 239 million people on the continent who face hunger every day. They get up every day not knowing where they're going to have a meal or when they're going to have a meal. And 3% of the population only has credit cards, and 1/4 of young people on the continent have accounts with formal institutions. So on the positives, and I do want you to take some positives as well. 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies today are on the continent. It has 31 of the top banks in the world. 37 of the 47 sub-Saharan African countries are on the U.S. government's democracy or evolving democracy list. You have a growing number of small and medium-sized enterprises, meaning that you also have a growing middle class. The largest size of the middle class ever at 130 million. The interesting thing about the next figure that I'm going to show you is that you have 136 million cell phones, mobile platforms on the continent. And I'll talk to you later about why I think that is so very important. There's 6 billion mobile phones in the world. 5 billion of those are in the developing world. And then you have that huge amount, the largest ever, 736 million. Africa today is the most mobilely engaged continent in the world. And then you have 18 countries that have a GDP, a gross domestic product, between 3% and 5%. The 2016 GDP for the United States is 0.5. So you have a lot of them certainly well outpacing growth even than we have here in the United States. And then last but not least, the region has collectively and potentially a $50 trillion economy, making it one of the largest areas in the world with the potential of great markets for U.S. goods and services, a great partner for investment and trade and business relationships. Today, many African nations are seeing the U.S. in a more positive light, particularly because we've looked at some of these issues that I've talked about. The countries that I know that really see us in a very positive light doesn't mean we don't have challenges, but we have a partnership with them, include South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Botswana, Kenya, and so many others. You know, as I noted above, these demographics are strategic issues for the United States as it looks forward in the 21st century, because the types of relationship that the U.S. forges with the continent over the next decade will become increasingly more important. Why? Because we will need new allies and strong allies. We will need partners on policy, on counterterrorism, partners to build coalitions. We will need support in international fora, from the United Nations to the World Trade Organizations to the African Union to the Islamic Organization of Islamic States and so on. In my view, Africa is the new frontier to engage with on all of these policies and all of these opportunities. Today we have a range of programs, strategic partnerships and educational programs, economic investment relationships that are really helping to lay the foundation for this relationship. In 2014, as many of you may know, the current president hosted for the first time ever all of the African heads of state except for 3. It is the first time that a U.S. president had hosted in the United States all of the African heads of state except for the 3 where they weren't meeting any kinds of guidelines. We just decided not to include those 3. The next forum will be this year, actually, in September of 2016 on the margins of the upcoming United Nations session. And I think that these are indications that we are now seeing Africa quite differently We are engaging differently, and we're taking this on as an important strategic partner to have. Not every country on the continent will be that, but if that is our framework, then we need to work within that framework to build a stronger partnership with the ones we have and reach out better to the ones that we don't have. So what are the next steps? How do we expand the elements I highlighted above? I think that the main thing is to think about quality of life. Because if people don't have quality of life, then some of these other issues are not going to be as attractive to them. And when I say quality of life, it really encompasses the things that the Sustainable Development Goals talk about. Addressing hunger, addressing inadequate health and educational opportunities, providing affordable housing, providing electrical power in some sort, whether it's renewable or otherwise, and creating jobs. All of the SDGs that I mentioned, Africa as a region has the highest poverty indicators in the world, along with Southeast Asia. So I wanted you to keep these 4 things in mind. Appreciate the range of demographics I have shared on Africa's population dividend and the positives on its economic, political, and natural resources. Remember, in many cases, how the U.S. will be viewed will be linked in good measure to how we engage in helping them. And I say it help, we don't have to do it all, but helping them engage to address the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to ensure that the next generation of young people see Africans as a friend, even if there are differences from time to time. And also remember, and maybe you don't know this figure, there are 1.6 million Africans in the diaspora living here in the United States. And they're here because they believe in our values and our systems, but they remain connected back home. And it's really important, I believe, particularly on some of the areas that I talked about, for Americans to really engage with the African diaspora. They are a part of us. They're here because they see us as an opportunity, and they remain connected back home, and all of those things are important. I don't mean with what I've said today that I think we need to be allies on every issue and we have to agree on every issue. That's just not realistic. But where I find Americans tend to fall short is that we don't listen, or we don't listen well enough. And we don't know how to engage necessarily if somebody does not agree with us. I don't mean in a combat situation. I'm not talking about in a combat or war situation. But I'm talking about daily dialogue, daily interaction. We need to do a better job of listening and finding out why there's a disagreement. Maybe there's a way we can build consensus. One of the courses I've designed is called Human Cultural Communications. And so some of that is in my first book that I completed last year. But it really is about understanding who's across the table from you, understanding what those challenges are that that person is facing that may not necessarily line up with what we see. But find a way to listen, build consensus, and it really is a two-way street. So here's what the U.S. is doing and what I think we might need to do more of, in my view. First, on combating poverty, hunger, and improving health and education systems, we have a food security program called Feed the Future. We have a health initiative on Ebola, and we're also helping African nations establish its version of a CDC, or Center for Disease Control. On HIV, we have the PEPFAR program, which really has helped change the trends of the impact of HIV/AIDS on the continent. There's the malaria initiative. I think that most Americans probably don't realize that malaria actually kills more people on the continent than sometimes other diseases. It is the most prevalent challenge in terms of diseases on the continent, in my view. On business and trade, we have such programs as the African Opportunity Act, which was first signed into legislation by President Clinton. I saw that signature photograph today when I was in the library. And then we are also helping, under that program, African businesses export their products to the U.S. duty-free. On education, we have the Young African Leadership Initiative, and where we're training young Africans by having them assigned to businesses as interns here, having them go to school here, and a number of other programs. And we also do basic education programs throughout the continent. Where we could do more is really using information technology to develop more workaround solutions for economic development. Remember I said there are 736 million mobile platforms on the continent. And that's how you're going to reach people. There's some great apps that have been created by very talented, very creative young Africans all over the continent that address some of these workaround solutions in agriculture. One of my favorites is iCow, which it works like a mercantile app for rural farmers, so they'll know the prices of what their goods and services are going to cost, et cetera. I think we need to do better and assist more on climate-smart food programs and climate-smart energy programs. We have one now on electricity called Power Africa, which is helping to bring energy, renewable as well, to parts of the continent. We need to continue to work with governments to improve their transparency, their good governance, their anti-corruption efforts, and really help build capacity so they are able to also respond and address to their social sector challenges. I will say that there has been a little bit of backsliding in the last 18 months on the continent on the democracy front. So those of us who are following those issues very closely, it's something that we're watching. You have this push now, for staying past constitutional limits with some countries, and so it is something that we that are working on African issues are following very closely. One of my biggest issues that I think we need to do more of, and we're doing something, but still a bit more would be helpful, is working with and developing programs to assist small and medium-sized enterprises. I'm working on a project right now on SMEs, but my main thing is when you look at the American context, we have about 28 million small and medium-sized businesses in the United States, which make up the backbone of our society, drive our middle class, create jobs, and so on. And I believe they play that same role for the continent. It's really only of late that development donors have really paid more and more attention to SME development, and it's one area where I think we can step up and do a little bit more. The last part of that would be vocational training. No donor, including the U.S., does enough, in my view, with vocational training. Everybody's not going to be an entrepreneur necessarily, or maybe they don't even want to be an entrepreneur. One of the most frustrating things for me when I was ambassador was trying to address that issue, because we had absolutely no program in vocational training at all. We're starting a little bit with that, but certainly not to the degree that we need. So I'm a big proponent of us doing more on vocational training. So fundamentally what I'm saying is that we need to engage differently than we have in the past with foreign partners. We must listen more, understand human cultural differences, and know that each African country may have its own path to further solidify its own democracy. So the question is, if we assist, how we assist, and how we help take care of some of these daunting sustainable development issues that I've highlighted. In sum, though, I do think that the United States sees Africa differently than it did in the 1990s, and I really have to give credit to President Clinton for that. I think for me, the turning point was in 1998 when he made the Africa trip, which I was on. We need to lean forward in assisting the continent on these sustainable development goals and challenges that I've mentioned, so that Africa itself can move up on our list of places to engage with as an important ally, as a market for two-way business and trade, and most importantly, as a partner with which we share a very strong friendship. Thank you.
you so much for that. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
Can you talk a little about China and Africa, please?
Who's asking?
I'm over here, I'm sorry.
I was looking. China and Africa, sure. You know, I don't fall in this camp, but I think overall within the U.S. government context, there's I call a frenemy relationship with China in so many ways. You know, China holds the largest amount of U.S. debt. You know, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So we have to always balance our geopolitical interaction with them, keeping that in mind. But I'm really of the mind that it's Africans' decision as to how they're going to engage with China, not ours. We need to stand on our own values. We need not to defer from those. And in making agreements, whether they're business deals or other things with China, the African nations and the African nationals will need to decide who they want to engage with. What I find heartening, though, is that when you talk about best practices, when you talk about transparency, all of those things, they turn to us for that. And I think that's a reflection of the values that we have. That's a reflection of where they want to be if they're on the path to democracy in the first place. And I think you see more and more of that happening. But where I think we are very different from China, and I take my hats off to China for this, is they are really engaging, in my view, more fundamentally in the cultural area than we are. The people-to-people exchange. We do a lot of people-to-people exchanges here, but theirs is quite different. You have, a huge amount of Chinese that remain as expats on the continent. They have families. They intermarry with the nationals in the country they are in. They've had since. Even predates us. They had since the late 1990s an annual summit with every African head of state. We didn't start that until the early 2000s. They still do that today. I do believe that the Chinese president has visited more countries on the continent directly in the last 18 months than we have collectively over the last 5 years. So there's things like that signal areas where I think we need to step up to the plate a little bit more. Yes, sir. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll
okay. Mm-hmm.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Ganati Namara. I'm originally from Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
As an African, I do understand some of the challenges you highlighted,
Mm-hmm.
and I also relate very much with the issues. Thank you also for highlighting some of the positive changes that are happening in Africa. You don't hear that very often, so that gets neglected. But there's a lot of change in Africa over the last 15 years. As one of the challenges, or maybe the major underlying causes for Africa's development, I would like to mention corruption and lack of good governance. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what the U.S. is doing in terms of fighting corruption in many African countries and promoting good governance.
Right. I mean, the cornerstone of our policy is good governance, and assumed under that, of course, is fighting corruption. Last year when the president of Nigeria was here, 90% of that conversation was, how we help engage on the anti-corruption fight. Last week, they're hosted by the United Kingdom. There's the Anti-Corruption Initiative, which is a worldwide initiative hosted by the UK. Secretary Kerry was there. It's an annual event trying to find a way to address corruption. But the flip side of that, which I think we tend to forget as Americans, there are the corruptors and the corruptees. Okay, so there are recipient countries, and the US is one of them. So is the UK, where the assets are. So we have a responsibility, and it was, I don't know if anybody saw this clip, but I'll just share it with you because I thought it was definitely a checkmate by the Nigerian president to push back on the comment that was made by the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was talking about, you know, the most corrupt countries in the world, and he had listed Nigeria and a few others. And that kind of, you know, did the trending on Twitter. And then, you know, the president of Nigeria is saying, you know, was being asked by the press, well, don't you want an apology? He said, I just want our money back. I could care less about the apology. And so, you know, there is the corruption is definitely a challenge. So is cybercrime, you know, all of those kinds of things. But there are the recipient countries too. And we have an initiative here trying to help countries like Nigeria track illicit enrichment assets in this country. That's a key part of our program with a number of countries, including being part of this international initiative that the UK hosts every year. Additionally, I think that you know, more and more countries, in terms of some of our programs, like AGOA, the legislation that I said President Clinton signed into law for the first time, the Millennium Challenge Account, which is another U.S. government program that helps with infrastructure development. You can't get access to those things unless you meet certain indicators, and anti-corruption efforts are one of those. So we have that as a marker in most of all of our programs. So I know that doesn't get out in the, you know, in the information stream that much, but we're very active on anti-corruption and also helping to track some of those missing assets. Okay.
Yes, sir. Robert, we're behind you.
Ambassador, first off, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to listen to you and share space with you. My question kind of gets into what you're just saying, but from a different angle. With a past and a history and even a present as riddled with violence and interracial prejudice as
Talking about the U.S.
the United States, yes. How do you think that we Americans can really, with a straight face, endeavor to be a leader and to be a representative and an example to the countries of Africa when we've exploited Africa and continue to persist in old ways of thought? So is there a way of moving forward and truly being a leader, or is this just some new form of colonialism?
I get asked a lot about the neocolonialism question, which is interesting. My pushback on that would be, I used to tell my staff, the best thing is always to be honest. And being an African American and being a child of a veteran that entered the United States military when it was a segregated military. My parents are from the South. They went to segregated schools. You know, I remember, not directly, of course, but certainly through family stories of my great aunts and uncles who at that time were, you know, in the Charleston city school system, who when they joined the NAACP, they lost their jobs. So I get that. And in Nigeria, I would have this question all the time when I was there as ambassador. And, you know, my response is, and it's the one I'm going to share with you today, the thing I like the most about our Constitution is this phrase, striving to be a more perfect union. Democracies are messy. They're not easy, and you have got to continually to work at that. And I think that, although of late, the challenges that we're facing in terms of the differences in the country today are really a little bit alarming to me personally, but I do think as a nation, for the most part, we try to live up to that and we try to work on that. Yes, history is history, and being honest about it, I think it's easier for somebody like me as a diplomat, if I'm talking or being asked that question, than somebody who doesn't look like me to be able to answer that question. But for me, I always was straight on, absolutely, we have racism in the United States. Absolutely have I felt like I've been a product of one. Of course, I know the stories in my family, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe in the system. And part of me being in the Foreign Service is because there were two things. One, I didn't like the relationship that we had with Africa when I joined the Foreign Service. I do like it today, and I spent my career, even if it was helping one person, one place, to moving forward on changing that dynamic. So the happiest day for me was working on President Clinton's trip to Africa in 1998. Because that, to me, if I had died and gone to heaven that day, or didn't do anything else in the Foreign Service, or continue to have a Foreign Service career, that would have been it, because I had worked my entire career for that point. Because it was really a turning point in seeing Africa differently. And I think that the response we're getting from Africa shows that we're seeing Africa differently. So be honest, note it's a work in progress. We're not perfect, we're still struggling. Sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. Right now we might even be in the two steps back phase of things, but we'll see. But I think it's okay to be a leader as long as you're honest. And I think if that is your mantle, I think you're in good shape.
Janice, 1 second. It's coming behind you.
Actually, I don't have a question. I have a comment. How are you, Robin? It's wonderful to see you.
How are you?
I'm good. President Clinton was here on Sunday and gave an amazing speech for the graduation, the 10th graduation of the school, public service. If he was here, I think what he would say that some of the best decisions he made about Africa, including that trip, was thanks to you.
Thank you.
Because you were a worthy advisor.
Thank
I'm
you.
so glad that you were there. And I'm just happy to see you here and
Thank you.
enjoyed so much your presentation.
Thank you
and
so
Glenn
very
Powell and his wife are also here to see
How are you? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. That means a lot to me, really. Thank you.
Did you have? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anjali Bassett, and I work with the World Bank on water resources management in Africa, particularly on transboundary rivers, so how to support countries in cooperating in management of shared rivers. And one of our partners is ECOWAS. I'm particularly interested in learning your role in representing the United States in ECOWAS, and what were, say, the top 3 agenda items during your time?
Yeah, ECOWAS has come a long way in terms of what it's doing and how it is engaged, and I would say all of the regional bodies are doing that, SADC in Southern Africa and the EAC in the East Africa community. I think for ECOWAS, which has, it's not quite as large as SADC, but it has, maybe 5 or 6 million people in the ECOWAS region. And the thing that we worked on the most when I was there was really regional integration. Because without regional integration for the continent writ large, but certainly for each of the sub-regions, then it's very hard for goods and services if it's hard for goods and services, it also means it's hard for business and trade. It's also hard for movement of people. At that time, tariffs, if you're in an economic region zone together, your tariffs are cheaper and makes everything easier. If you're in an economic zone, political zone together, can you work in each other's country? Those were the challenges that we faced when I was there today. I think what's probably on the top of ECOWAS's agenda today are some of the attendant issues coming out of climate change, but certainly the counterterrorism aspect. My time in Nigeria, it wasn't called Boko Haram then, it was called the Nigerian Taliban actually when I was there. But I was there when the resurgence happened and when the leader was killed and when we had the underwear bomber and all of the other things. And I do some talks around the country on cybersecurity and really looking ahead on some of these challenges. I was giving a speech on this issue actually right before coming out here. So I think that today for countries like ECOWAS, countries in ECOWAS, it's certainly the counterterrorism aspect, and then it would be the job creation aspect. Because you're going to have, remember those figures I gave you on youth this, 6 million plus. That's providing the current growth rate stays the same at 2.4, which it may not. So that figure could be a lot more than that. If you don't create jobs, what kind of disenfranchisement is going to happen to people in that age group? And we see trends like that now. You see that in being a driver toward things like cybercrime or migration issues or attraction to terrorist organizations, even if you don't believe in the philosophy of the organization. It's a way out. I'm not saying that that's what's happening across the board, but it's something to pay attention to. And when I was talking to a group the other day, I was talking about pay attention to these global trends. It's going to show you where your challenges are going to be, and it's going to show you what you need to step up and do. So I think in the place of climate change, particularly, I don't even know if this has really hit the main media in the United States, but you have the largest famine and drought going on in East and Southern Africa. 36 million people are affected. It's the largest since 1989, since the 27 World Aid campaign there to food aid campaign. So climate change to me is a driver of conflict. It's a driver of refugees and IDPs, and so to me that would be on the top of the agenda for any of the regional organizations today. Yeah, thank you.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for visiting Arkansas for the first time. She does have a book over here if you want to come and visit with her after the event, so thank all of you for coming out.
Can I just say something on that? Sorry, I didn't even mention that really. I talked a little bit about human cultural communications, and one of the things that's happening on that, you have a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere that have signs and symbol systems that are really a communication expression. It tells about the social, economic, development aspects of a culture. Well, those are dying off. We have 6,000 of them dying off in the world. This book focuses on one in the Nigerian context, and it's telling the story of this disappearance by some of the practitioners that still practice that sign and symbol system, and they're all in their 70s and 80s. So all the pictures in the book I took, I did the field research, all the graphics I did as well, and so I wanted to at least explain that that's what the book is all about. Okay. Thank you so much for hosting me today.